why there's a universal design for learning, and in particular, why don't we adopt the principles from the standard universal design principles in architecture and built environment. And when she said the word easier, things need to be easier for people with disabilities or everywhere. Actually, in education, that's not actually the right kind of goal. The thing in education we want are, you've probably heard the term, education is often about setting up desirable difficulties. That our job isn't to make things easy, it's to make them challenging. Our job is, though, to reduce the number of undesirable difficulties. Kids often face in our present schools undesirable difficulties, but our job isn't to make it easier, it's to make the challenge right. And that's why we set about defining principles for universal design that apply to learning, which are quite different than the physical environment. So those universal design for learning is a framework of principles and guidelines for how we would do that. How do we make education so that it is appropriately challenging, not easier, for everyone engaged in it. And we have a number of principles, which are certainly within the whole universal design idea, but the principles derive more from the neuroscience of learning. So I'll go through it a little bit, but here's the principles, and then there's broad guidelines about what do you need to address in order to make universal designs for learning. And just as a quick, what is it? Universal Design for Learning is a research-based framework for educational design in a world where learners are diverse, which is to say, the normal world. The foundations of UDL come from two places. One is advances in the cognitive and affective learning sciences, which is to say, what is learning and how different are individuals' ways of learning and needs for learning. And secondly, advances in modern learning technologies. So actually, both of these are required for universal design for learning in the sense that we need better understandings of learning to do it well, and often we need better technologies for learning than our traditional technologies have been. I don't want to talk about it today. We had an earlier session that did more of this, but UDL has become policy in a number of arenas in the US. And one of them is in the Higher Education Act that recently came out. It defines universal design for learning, says what it is, we should be training teachers to do universal design for learning, and so on. And many states and districts are now adopting UDL, excuse the shortening, for their practices for all students. And that's been a big change. By the way, not a universal change in the US at all. The fact that there's legislation doesn't mean people actually do it, of course. We're no different than your country. So I want to talk a little bit about the foundations. The title of the talk emphasized the emotional aspects, which I've been asked to give a more broad introduction to UDL, and I'll get to the emotional stuff late, but it won't be the focus of my talk. It'll be more broadly on UDL. And I'll try to do that in the next 45 minutes. So what do new technologies teach us about the organ we learn with? And I think you know there's been radical changes in what we know about learning because of the power of technology to illuminate how the brain actually learns. And the new way that people are talking about our brains is as the connectome. And the idea, the word connectome is a play off of the word genome. And it's what's the underlying thing that makes us different one from another and that makes learning possible. And neuroscientists are much more invested now in, I guess I can't pace, in seeing that it's the way our brains are connected rather than, let's say, its volume or the number of neurons. There are animals that have more neurons than we do. That's not what makes us smart. What makes us smart is the way in which our neurons are connected And what makes us different from one another is the way in which they're connected. So the big lesson first is that everyone's connectome is different. And by the analogy with the genome, just like your genome differs from everyone else's, your connectome differs from everyone else's, or like your fingerprint or so on, but even more differential than that. I'm going to concentrate on three sort of broad aspects of the connectome. I'll do that really quickly. First, the back part of your brain, what's highlighted here in purple, does the same thing, actually. Sometimes neuroscience looks more complicated than it really is. But in fact, the back part of your brain does really one thing. It takes in information from all of your senses and makes meaning out of it, makes objects, makes concepts, makes receptive language. All of that is done with the back of your brain. All of your senses arrive there, and it's kind of nice simplifying part. The front half of I'm talking about cortex here for those that care, for the front half of your brain is organized quite differently, has different looking neurons connected differently, and it has its purpose to plan, execute, and monitor actions. So this is the part of your brain you act with. And it includes everything from planning to act and imagining to act, all the way to actually moving the muscles to act on the world. So that's the second big part of your brain. And the third part that I'll concentrate on the end of my remarks is buried in the middle of your brain. And I'll make an argument that it's in the middle for good reason. It's the centerpiece of your nervous system in terms of learning for sure, but also in terms of who you are. If I make lesions in the other parts of the brain, you might lose vision, or you might lose the ability to move, or to be skillful, or have executive functions, things like that. But if we damage here, you lose the things that make you feel like you. The priorities, the way you evaluate the world, what you think is important, your personality. Lesions in these areas are really much more what feels like you. You can't damage here without changing how you feel and how other people recognize who you are. Okay. So what have we learned about, first I'm going to do a little bit longer on recognition networks. I call them recognition networks, the back half. And then we'll do the others a little bit more briefly. So I wish I could pace. We don't have Brian, we don't have a little lavalier or something. I hate standing behind the podium. I wish I'd thought of it earlier. So I want to introduce you, and I apologize, I did this at the AHEAD conference recently, but I was suggested I would do it again here, so let me do that. I want to talk about this part of recognition cortex. Notice it's in the back half of your brain. This is auditory cortex, where you make meaning out of sound. And here's me and my wife. I'm the one on the left. We have differences in our connectome. Ruth has perfect pitch. I'm not sure if is anyone, actually this is an audience big enough, we should have someone with perfect pitch. Does anybody have perfect pitch here? Is that going to work? Oh, great. Thank you, Brian. Okay, is that great? That's right, we each have our anxieties. Standing behind a podium is a big anxiety for me. Okay, so Ruth has perfect pitch. And does anyone have perfect pitch? No one is willing to admit it? Because you're afraid I'll ask you to sing. All right. So 1 in 400 or so is usually the estimate have perfect pitch. And I'm more like you. And what we know because of recent research is, what's the difference neurologically between Ruth with her perfect pitch and me? We both recognize pitch in the same place, but there are big and small differences in our auditory cortex. And in fact, this is what it looks like. A person with perfect pitch has what would be called a superhighway of connections. This is their connectome. That the connections here in auditory cortex are big, wide, like a big, is it M50 I came in on? You know, terrific traffic jam when I came in. But at any rate, supposed to be fast-moving and so on. Carry a lot of volume of information in auditory cortex. So, and this is my auditory cortex, sort of little country one-lane roads. Adequate to the task, not broken or stuff, but much less connectivity, much less volume of information flowing within auditory cortex. Notice it's very distinctive. That is, we're the same on the right side. It's really on the left side. There's a really difference, and it's significant and visible in our connectomes. And the way it's described is that Ruth is hyperconnected. She's hyperconnected in that left auditory cortex, and it's asymmetric. So this is the way we differ. The interesting question comes, who has a disability? We have very different connectomes, very different ways of recognizing pitch. Ways isn't the right way, but we differ in our recognition abilities around pitch. So let me start with Ruth's perspective. So Ruth is a semi-professional singer, sings in Boston Symphony Hall and so on, sings all the time in professional groups. And when we were dating, she knew that I had many, many years of musical training, and I think she saw that as a key asset. What she didn't understand was the difference in our connectomes and that I would have such poor pitch. Because for her, the ability to just recognize when you play a B flat, Ruth knows immediately it's a B flat. It's not like she has to hum or do anything, or just like you recognize red, you don't have to think about it. So if you play a B flat on the piano keyboard or anything, Ruth goes, that's a B flat, easy, snappy. And the idea, it's very hard for her to grok what it's like to live in a universe where you don't know what pitch is. And it took her a while to discover that I'm in that category. And worse, that I passed it on to our children. Because her view of happy married life was out of the movie The Sound of Music, you recall, where we would have 6 or 8 children, and we'd drive in a Volkswagen bus across the Alps singing in 8-part harmony. So, as it turns out, Ruth now has an entire family of disabled people who can't sing like she can. So for her, our connectomes are really disabled connectomes. But the argument I'm going to be making here will not be foreign to any of you, given why you're here, is the environment matters. Context will determine who's handicapped and who's not. So let me describe a different context. We both go to a church together, and in the church, things are quite different. For one thing, Ruth sits next to me, and when the hymn book shows a B flat, I'm sort of nearby, but not really exactly on a B flat, okay? So Ruth has immediate choice. Does she sing the B flat, which she sees in the hymn book, or does she, which I prefer, be affiliative with her husband and sing what I'm singing, okay? So there's a conflict. But the problem is that everybody else in the church is like me and you, apparently, who have relative pitch. So we're nearby, but not really singing B flat. But the worst problem is that our church has a very old organ, and actually it is playing a full tone and a half below what's written. So when the person presses the B flat key, it's really playing a G, whatever it is, I can't remember, but it's a step and a half low, okay? Which happens, organs drift. So picture Ruth. She's got perfect pitch, she sees the B flat in the hymn book, knows exactly what to do. No one in the church is singing a B flat. They're not all singing the same note, but they're definitely not singing a B flat. So Ruth is quite troubled in church, and she sort of mumbles. And what I love is the irony. In our church, I'm considered the singer. Because I'm there, and it's my only time once a week, I sing loud and boisterously. So people ask me to join the choir, and it's fabulous. And here's Ruth, who really can sing, but in our church, it's hard for her to sing. Because in our church, relative pitch is way better. And in fact, the reason there are 400 of you who have relative pitch is mostly it's better in most circumstances, unless you happen to go to Juilliard or want to sing in Symphony Hall, in which case perfect pitch is better. So disability in our minds, and probably yours too, is always defined in the intersection between the individual and the context, particularly when we use words like handicap. Environments can be handicapping, and context matters in all of these. So we're here because we want to define contexts which are less disabling for everybody. I want to just take a moment to talk about literacy in this same frame. There's a lot of advances recently in the neuroscience of reading, and I want to just go after that. In the old view, reading had two main components: decoding words and having language comprehension, understanding language, and that led to reading. And there's a place, we'll see in a second, where in fact we recognize written words. The brain specializes, just like Ruth has an area for pitch, Ruth has an area for written words, so do you. It's called the word form area. And comprehension, the simple view of reading comprehension, was a couple places in your brain would be what you needed for reading comprehension. Let me show you what actually lights up if you put someone in a machine and see what lights up when they're reading a word. Watch what happens. It's about 1.5 seconds. Let me show it again. Okay, you can see, wow, a lot of the brain lit up. So the old views of what reading is, are not correct, because the brain actually does a lot more things than we used to think reading entailed. And in fact, recent studies have exploded the whole thing, so that in fact, when we watch someone reading, what we find is that their brain, lots of different parts of their brain light up depending on what exactly they're reading. So this was reading narratives, and in fact, when you're reading a sentence that's about a character, this part of your brain lights up. And you know what that part of your brain does? That's the part of the brain that you recognize people on the street with, that you recognize people, characters. So in fact, when you are reading about a character, if you're reading well and understanding, you're imagining the character with the very same cortex you would recognize characters. So what you're doing is running a simulation. You're in fact stimulating those same neurons to say, I'm picturing this character, and you picture it with this part of your brain. And if you're reading a sentence that's about the goal of that character, what they want to accomplish in life, what lights up is the very part of your brain that you set goals for yourself with. So you're imagining, you're running a simulation of goal setting in your brain. So good readers are reading, depending on what the passage is about, with most of their brain. In fact, I challenge my graduate students to show me a part of the brain you don't read with. That's much harder than showing me parts of the brain you read with. So the old views of kind of a few small areas just aren't correct. Reading is much more interesting and complex than we thought. And so I just want to talk about dyslexia for a moment. So people with dyslexia are in this middle slide, and they have a big difference from people who say these are 9-year-olds. Good readers have that green area lights up, which is the word recognition, the word form area. Small area in the brain lights up as one of the places that good readers read with. And dyslexics don't. That part isn't lighting up. They're not using that part of their brain, not using the word form area to read with. And it makes it hard for them to recognize individual words. But I want to point out that this is just a small part of what goes into reading, decoding the words. Remember, all those other parts I just talked about have nothing to do with this. And I want to come back to what that means in a second. Advances in the neurosciences have shown us about other kinds of disabilities too, and they're different than we thought. For example, just recent studies, fabulous studies, looked at children with autism and found out that in fact, much like Ruth's auditory cortex, they are hyper-connected. So what they found is not that they have a hole in their head, which everybody thought, you're going to see brain damage, something like that. that wasn't what they found. What they found is that, in fact, compared to typically developing children, there's this hyperconnectivity, more connections, exactly what Ruth's auditory cortex looks like. And, just because you're probably wondering, does that mean people with autism are more likely to have perfect pitch? And the answer is absolutely. Oh, I like that, absolute pitch. Kids with autism are much higher incidence of perfect pitch. In fact, just to make an advertisement here, I hate it when we pull kids with disabilities out of art and music and all of these subjects, because in fact it's often an area where they could excel. So kids with autism are more likely to be the best singer in the school and should have a chance to do that rather than we pull them out and put them into remedial, they're often put in remedial decoding classes, which is crazy because they're often the best decoder too. So they're different than we used to think. The nature of disability, and again, remember, this is contextual. That is to say, we can either show that kids with autism look very, very disabled, depending on the task, or if we put them in decoding tasks, they're often actually stronger, and all kinds of memory tasks. There's all kinds of tasks where kids with autism are actually better than you and I in the same way that Ruth is. And there's all kinds of different kinds of readers. I've just given an example. I probably didn't make that clear. So kids with autism are the exact opposite of kids with dyslexia. They have fabulous decoding. They can recognize every word. The very first clinical case I ever saw was a kid who showed up at the clinic because he had been the top speller in the city of Boston, won the spelling bee the first 2 years of his schooling, and then he hit 4th grade and he didn't understand anything. And nobody could figure it out because they thought, he's the best reader we have. Why isn't he understanding? Because his difficulty wasn't in decoding words at all. His difficulty was in the other parts I was showing you. And yet they were putting him back into decoding school. It was crazy. Okay, so we got to know. And people with all kinds of disabilities and differences have very different ways in which they read and very different ways in which we should go after their difficulties. You can see the problem. We have, in schools, typically we've had a fixed, uniform learning technology, printed books. And we have these very diverse learners, kids that are very different. One-size-fits-all kinds of technologies, very different kids. And the result is that we blame the students. You're not good enough, you're dyslexic, you're disabled, you're handicapped, all kinds of words. When in fact, what we have is a very fixed technology for learning and expect all the kids to act as if they're the same. New media changes the equations in wonderful ways. I love it that you're a technology university, and we were talking earlier that actually schools were always technology places. It's just they were built around the technology of print. And the technology of print was a fabulous innovation 500 years ago and democratized learning in many ways. But print is a very fixed, one-size-fits-all technology, and no longer in the modern world is a good technology for learning. It's way too narrowly focused to be successful across the spectrum of kids. So new media changes away from a print standard toward a standard of much broader sets of possibilities. Print is a foundation for flexibility. We can take the same information and it separates information from its display, which books don't do. Books, you dive the information into the book itself. And so we can take that same information and present it in multiple ways. So we can say, I want it this way, or this language, or this color. I want it to be something I see, or I want it to be something I touch. All this can happen automatically, say. Put that out in refreshable Braille for me so that I can, in fact, know what's there on that website or something. And I can take that information and speak it aloud. So actually, the computers now decode. Kids used to have to decode. It was the only way to get the information when we used old technologies like print. But actually now, all of your machines, including your cell phones, decode text. Very different. And we can take that text and put it out as sign language on an avatar. So same information in a digital form allows us many opportunities to provide information for a much broader set of kids. But I want to be clear that the real reason to do universal design for learning isn't just to make access, but to make better learning in general. So I wanted to, I've done this before, once in Ireland, I apologize, but I just want to show what it means to do a multiple representation. Just because I'm we're a little bit late. I want to go quick. I would typically love to play you a little bit of this Bach piece and ask you to comprehend it. Can you all go with me and say if I did that, you probably wouldn't comprehend it, okay? Just play it and say, write me an essay of what's going on here. You wouldn't be able to do it. Okay, good. Some of you would. There'd be a difference. But if I gave you another representation of it, this representation, some in the audience would actually be able to quickly know what was going on in the piece and would comprehend it. Still, for the vast majority of you, that would probably not be the case. You wouldn't understand it. So I wanted to show you in new media, this is a print representation. In new media, there's many ways to represent. So let me show you a representation. This is the Bach in a way that digital media allows. Watch this next phrase, very clear visually, but hard to hear. It's always hard to stop Bach. So, at any rate, and if I had more time, I'd like to kind of go into a fugue piece, but I think I'm going to skip it for now. But what this does is really allows you to see the structure of complicated music, because in the fugue piece, you get to see, there's a little theme there, and you get to recognize it quickly visually and to see it coming. And you can see that, oh my God, Bach turns it upside down, and he stretches it out, and he does cool things with this theme, which you don't hear very well at all. But in another representation, you see what Bach has done, what a fugue is, and how he's played with that theme again and again and again in different contexts. A beautiful representation. So even people who can't read music, even people who don't have good pitch, can understand and comprehend what Bach is doing in a new way. And I have to say, I love to do these. There's hundreds of these on the web now, before I go to a concert, because I start to understand the music, and now I'll understand it more. And lastly, I want to say, because sometimes people think universal design for learning is about those poor, unfortunate people with disabilities. My favorite story on this is after viewing these, I thought this is fabulous for me. And I have a friend who is a musicologist. He teaches music, and I wanted to show it to him. I went to his place and said, can I show you this visualization of Bach's Toccata and Fugue? And he said, oh, David, I know the piece. You know, I've played it hundreds of times. And I kept trying to convince him. And he said, I teach it, I know the piece. Let's talk about sports. And so his daughter, luckily, was there, a teenager, and she said, Dad, why don't you just look at it? So he says, okay. So we go through the thing, and the fugue is really rich, because it's much more complicated, but you start to really see it. Anyway, so he's glued to the screen after a few minutes of being hesitant. And then at the end, he says, wow, I never understood what Bach was doing with that whole middle passage before. After teaching it hundreds of times, he still didn't understand it. But that visualization made him realize, my God, he turned that over and he stretched it out, and I didn't even notice it before. So universal design for learning is not about kids at the bottom of any distribution, but how do we create media that are strong enough to handle the full diversity of students we're likely to face. So if students are bored, then you're not doing a good enough universal design for learning. It's not about just raising the floor, it's about raising the ceiling as well. How does a universally designed technology change the pathways to reading? I just put this slide in. I just want to say the technology is fabulous for even people like you. This is the Glee website, which has a karaoke part to it. So you go in there, and they've got all these songs, and you can sing into the website. But then it has a perfect button. It says, "Do you want pitch correction?" And you go, "Why, yes, I would." So you can sing with great emotion and great phrasing and beautiful, like really the inner singer. And then just like a rock star does, say, "I'd like you to correct that pitch." So my wife never knows that I sang it with pitch correction. How does university change reading? So in fact, what we can do now is we can outsource. We can outsource. Kid doesn't have the decoding chip in their brain very well. We can outsource that. The computer can do it. Big deal. We didn't used to have glasses either. Yeah, so technology is powerful. Decoding can happen easily. And now we call it audio-assisted reading. It's still reading. Remember all those other parts I showed? Those are really hard to do. That's the high bar we want, kids understanding text. But the decoding chip is a minor part, and it's easy to outsource it. Similarly, vocabulary. Kids come in with different languages, different cultural backgrounds. Vocabulary is an area where they're very different. And it used to be, if you didn't have the vocabulary, you couldn't read it. Now, we outsource the vocabulary. You just put, as you know, you can easily make every word define itself within a digital environment. Everything can look itself up in Google, and you can put it in 42 languages. All of that is easy to outsource. Embedded vocabulary assists can be part of the environment. So we can change, and I could do about 8 of these, we can change the nature of the relationship between the kid and reading by looking at, if vocabulary is a problem, we still want you to be at the high level of comprehension, so we'll give you vocabulary assist. We can give you decoding assist because we want you to understand science and geography and history. Go for it. And it's changing the way in which people think about these things. In the US, there's a NIMAS legislation, the National Instructional Materials Accessibility Standard, which says, you know what? Given what the technology can do, you can't just give out printed textbooks to everybody and assume that's going to work. In fact, it's just like making a building that people with physical disabilities can't enter. Printed textbooks are not good enough. This is the first legislation, a universal design legislation, that says textbooks aren't good enough, and there's a standard, an accessibility standard for what you must do. It's an XML digital standard, which has been adopted everywhere. Every textbook in the US now is available in a NIMAS version. Now it's actually been incorporated straight into EPUB specifications. So books now, every kid can get a book that does audio-assisted reading, blah, 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 blah. But what's changed, the biggest thing for me was not the XML standard, but that these words. What's it good for? It's good for students who are blind or other students with print disabilities. First time anybody's seen that. Print disabilities is very different than saying someone has a learning disability. It starts to do that co-locating, that the nature of the disability is in their interaction with print. Saying a kid has a learning disability, which I tend not to do anymore unless there's a specific reason for it, is very different than saying they have a print disability. When they have a print disability, then you start looking for, is print a good idea to use for this kid when we can use digital environments, we can use other means of teaching, so on and so forth. So in the US now, this word is real. And kids can go to a doctor's office and get defined as a kid with a print disability, which says print is not a good medium for me in its inaccessible environment, and you need to do something better. And they can. And I love it that now I think of us doing not so much blaming the kid as now we can blame the curriculum. Is our curriculum print disabled? Is it so dominated by print that we're going to be disabling kids? And in fact, I also love it that now this article I loved from somebody here in the UK, is English a dyslexic language? Recognizing the fact that, in fact, the incidence of reading disability is much higher, of dyslexia is much higher in English-speaking countries than in other countries, showing that actually it too is co-located. English is a language that generates dyslexia much more than other languages. All of these things are contextual. So a decoding disability, which there are. Some kids are really not very good at decoding, just like you're not very good at pitch, is not a learning disability per se, unless the curriculum is itself print disabled. If we're going to only assign things in print, then we're going to get kids with dyslexia. Okay. Universal Design for Learning looks at how do we design environments that are, in fact, perceivable by everybody, that the language and symbols do things like decode themselves and define themselves, and that there are supports built in, like vocabulary supports and so on, comprehension things are built in, so that everybody has an equal shot. But the main goal is to define really good teaching environments, which aren't so limited in them. And I'll skip these to say you can get detailed in the UDL guidelines. It looks at what are the kinds of options one should provide and what's the evidence from research about whether they're effective or not. So if you go and look here, then you'll be able to see what do you do to make vocabulary work, what do you do to make syntax work, and so on. And I'm going to skip this next section a little bit, but we would do the same thing when we ask kids to express what they know. That is, look at what are the requirements and which are desirable difficulties and which are undesirable difficulties. And let's remove the undesirable difficulties. And everything from executive function, which Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the World Wide Web, is ADHD as they come. I talked about him earlier, so I'm going to skip it. There are things you can do about ADHD. You can put in apps for self-control, blah, 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 blah. Want to skip that. More later. I want to get to engagement, this last principle. Provide multiple means of engagement. Turns out that we're all very different, not only in the ways that we receive information and the ways in which we can act, but we're very different in this core part of the brain. And I want to point out how important it is. It's at the center of the brain. And I think there's good reason for it. It is the centerpiece in whether you're going to learn anything or not. And Hollywood, oddly enough, gets it. I just clipped out these, here's a bunch of the popular movies from Hollywood about education. Not a one of them is about some cute little way to teach long division or some new algorithm about, they are all movies about emotion. Okay, you've seen some of these. Because Hollywood recognizes, oh my God, the core thing for all of these super teacher movies is that they're able to get to that emotional center of kids and make them want to learn. Because if you can make them want to learn, then they do fabulous. And kids are sitting mostly in our schools and bored and terrified and all kinds of things that are emotionally not good. So what do emotions do? Okay, and you probably know this, but emotions mobilize the body. They get you ready for taking action. Something's frightening, something's exciting, whatever. So there's tons of things it does to your body to get you ready. And it's that preparation. And it also mobilizes the brain the same way. I didn't put a picture in, but emotions mobilize, get your brain ready for a bunch of things, including get you ready to pay attention to some things and not others. And in fact, what is recently come up in the neuroscience is thinking about emotions as learning signals. That emotions are the thing that says to the body, mobilize yourself, get ready. And they're signals to the brain, learn this. They're signals. Something important is happening, learn this as opposed to all the other things that are happening right now. The role of emotions is to optimize according to core values. That is, things that keep you alive. Things that you like. Those affective middle part of your brain is where your core values are. And emotions is to optimize according to those core values. You need enough food, you need enough excitement, you need enough novelty, you need enough sex, etc. Those are the core values. I shouldn't have said that last part. According to core values, what is sought, attended, remembered, predicted, achieved? It biases you. And this is the part of the brain you want to get to if you're teaching. And we can see lots of examples of the significance of these emotional processes in dominating the rest of the way our brain works. I'm going to skip that slide. I want to go to this one. The Capgras syndrome gives, for me, the best neurological indication of how important the emotional side and the emotional barriers to learning are. Capgras syndrome, and there's YouTube videos, you can look it up later, is one where a patient shows up at a psychiatrist's office, usually after seeing their doctor, reporting that their loved one has been taken over by an alien. It's called the imposter syndrome, too. And it's unshakable. So they're in the office, and the loved one could be out in the lobby. And the person says, that person out there in the lobby is an imposter. It's not my wife. And the psychiatrist, blah, 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 used to go through all kinds of things about mothers and everything. Now we know it's a very small lesion, okay? And I want to tell you what happens. But basically what happens is that, in fact, the person recognizes, the victim, unquote, the patient, recognizes perfectly the perceptual parts. The recognition part of their brain works perfectly. And they recognize that person looks exactly like my wife. And they even know what to do. The front part of the brain's working fine. They know what to do with their wife, how to greet her, how to da-da-da. What's happened is that the perceptual part has been disconnected from the emotional part. Just a disconnection. So what does that mean? It means when you see the loved one, you don't feel the loved one. Because you don't even know it, but right now, even when you look at the people at your table, these inner core parts of your brain are evaluating whether you like them or not. Are they good for you or not? Everything is being evaluated all the time to set priorities, so you'll know who should I talk to and who should I ignore. That is happening all the time. For a loved one, it's quite extreme. It says, oh, not only is that Ruth, but you love her. And when you measure physiologically, you can see it. The body does all these cool things that say you're in love with her. But for the first time, when this disconnection happens, the person sees Ruth, but doesn't feel Ruth. So then the brain has a challenge. What are we going to do? It looks like Ruth, but it doesn't feel like Ruth. I'm not feeling the love. For me, it demonstrates what's most important. What happens is, if it doesn't feel like Ruth, the brain says it can't be Ruth. No matter how close it looks to her, emotion, affect triumphs. In the brain, if it doesn't feel like her, it can't be her. So what happens? The brain confabulates, makes up this crazy story. If it doesn't feel like her, it must be an imposter. It goes through this enormous, elaborate thing. But for me, it shows how deep and important emotions are in everything. It will dominate your perception, and you know that. And we've done, and everybody's done lots of experiments that show this, but we don't take it seriously. So we've had a student who now works with us, but anyway, measured what's the affective reaction of kids who have had reading disabilities, reading difficulties, when they read a passage. And I want to be clear, this is going to be low stakes. They're just going to read with a person near them, not in a high stakes test. And what she found is they're in a completely different emotional state than the rest of the students. Here's just an example. Their heart rate is greatly elevated. In fact, it's so elevated that there's no overlap. They're in two different states. The kids who have a reading disability are in a threat state. Physiologically, by cortisol, by heart rate, by breathing rate, by blah, 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 blah. They're under threat. So the idea of us as educators sort of saying, hey, here's a new book. We're all going to read this and it's going to be fun. Some of your kids, and including kids in college, are having a threat. They're feeling this is not a good and safe environment. Why? Because they've had a long history now of failure, of humiliation, of all of these things. So their body has learned this isn't good. It's just like your ancestors learned. It's not good to be out here on the savannah near the lake because that's where the lions hang out. Kids are sitting in school going, this reading environment is not good for me, not healthy for me. And it's hard to overcome. Another one I just want to mention, as people this morning didn't know too much about it, stereotype threat. How many people know what stereotype threat is? Okay, so it's a sort of big thing in the US right now. Stereotype threat is what a ton of research has shown is that if you take, in the US, we have lots of problems, the racial divide. If you take individuals who are African American and have them self-identify on a test, check a box, say I'm African American, you know what happens? The scores go down. Their scores go down. Done tons of experiments to show this. And what people describe it as is that they now have to process something else, which is your expectations that they are not going to do well on this because you have a stereotype about their race. So now their emotional system is having to deal with that, your stereotype of them, and it gives them an extra processing they have to do, and their scores on what's supposed to be a cognitive test go down. Happens all the time. This is not a subtle effect. And it happens across other minorities, women who are taking a test in mathematics. If they self-identify as a woman, their scores go down. These are big effects showing that your emotions, just like in the Capgras, are determining how you see things, how you respond to them. And not taking that into account means we're not understanding the barriers. We have just begun for the National Science Foundation to study stereotype threat among kids with disabilities, because we went to them to say we would like to ameliorate this, and they said there's no good research evidence. Now, what do you think the chances are that people with disabilities don't feel that you have a stereotype about them as learners? Absolutely. So, just to be clear, we've already got the first findings out. Yes, people with disabilities feel the stereotype threat, and not understanding that and realizing they're in a different emotional place than other people are means we're not paying attention to the barriers that can occur in teaching. Now, I realize that I'm at the end of my time and not quite at the end of my slides. I started a little bit late. Do I have fuzziness or not? But you be honest, 2 minutes. But I just want to say that teaching is emotional work. And if you think about what are the barriers that your students face, everything from the various stereotype threats they feel, the stresses they've felt about not being good readers in the past, tons and tons of things like that. That CAST, our work has largely been in the cognitive aspects for 20 years, perceptual, cognitive, physical. But for all of those groups, we now see the emotional aspects as the key thing. If we don't deal with the emotional aspects of their learning, then we aren't going to actually be successful. We can make the stuff accessible, but we need to make learning be, we need to handle the emotional aspects of learning first and foremost. So I'm just going to end with, and I'm sorry, this only is about 30 seconds. This I usually show to show the beginnings of CAST, where we first learned how powerful technology can be. But what I want you to see is how powerful the emotion is in the room. So this is our first time working with a student who has a very significant locked-in motor syndrome, can't move anything but his chin. And we were brand new at this, and we're putting a little switch under his chin. And we're trying it out. And he's got a screen, and we're trying to get him to use Morse code to spell to us. He's never communicated with anybody. He's very locked in, but he can move his chin and his eyes, and you'll see something else. But anyway, so we're holding it. We're trying to get him to be able to do this, but we're not sure he can. Everybody thinks he's profoundly retarded. He was going to go to an institution before he came to us. So here is Ann Meyer, the co-founder of CAST, working with him. We don't know really what we're doing, but uh-oh, not hearing sound. Brian, have we got sound? All right, I don't want to take time to fix the sound. I'm trying to think if there's anything I did wrong. I think we got sound. Brian's maybe not there. All right, so actually, this is only 30 seconds. I want to monitor. They're trying to get it. He's not quite right. And then all of a sudden he gets one letter, which is he had to do it short, and gets excited. Oh my God, and look at him. And watch what happens to Ann. It's all emotional work. That was the broadest Matthew's mother ever saw him smile. She'd never seen anything like that. It was the first time to communicate effectively. An emotional thing happened, And what I love about it is that Anne cries. She has to wipe her tear, because good teaching is always emotional teaching. And in a great technology university, that'll be the case too. Anyway, thank you for your time.